The orders came down like a hammer in a silent room, echoing without mercy, final and absolute. She was to leave at once, they told her, leave the compound, leave the people she had lived beside, trained beside, laughed and bled beside. She was to board the transport before nightfall and vanish from the valley that had become her world. It was not framed as a request, not spoken with the softness of kindness, but delivered as a command, the kind that left no room for protest, no edges to cling to, no footholds for argument. She had been chosen to survive, to carry away what knowledge and memory she could, to keep alive the story of those who would not see another dawn. The council believed that by removing her, at least one thread of their existence would remain. She listened, her jaw tight, her throat dry, her hands curled into fists at her sides. Around her, the others stood silent, unwilling to meet her eyes, because to do so would be to admit the cruelty of what was happening. She felt the weight of it pressed down on her chest, not the weight of survival but the weight of abandonment, the taste of betrayal that no one wanted to name. They thought she would obey because she always had. They thought she would bow her head because she was loyal, because she carried discipline in her bones, because she knew what it meant to serve. But loyalty, she realized in that moment, did not mean leaving. Loyalty meant staying, standing, facing the dark horizon with the people who had carried her through every storm before this one. Her eyes lifted and she saw them, one by one, her companions, her family in all but blood. The sharp-featured captain who had once patched her wounds with hands that trembled less from fear than from stubborn determination. The broad-shouldered farmer who had taught her how to coax vegetables from the soil even when the ground seemed barren. The quiet boy who had grown into a man while carrying burdens too large for anyone his age, yet never letting go of hope. They were all here, waiting for the night to fall, waiting for the end that loomed closer with each hour. And she was supposed to walk away, to pretend that her life was worth more than theirs, that her breath carried greater value than the hundreds who would stay behind. No, she thought, no, not like this. She remembered the sound of the alarms 3 days before, the blare that shattered the stillness of morning, the sky smeared with smoke where fire rained down from the ridges. They had fought to hold the line, fought with everything they had, but the enemy had come like a tide, endless, merciless, pushing them back step by step until the compound walls themselves shook beneath the onslaught. They had known then, as they knew now, that there would be no reinforcements, no cavalry rushing to their aid. They were alone, a forgotten outpost on the edge of a collapsing world, and all they could do was endure long enough to give others, somewhere else, a chance to escape. She had accepted that fate. She had embraced it, because it was what they had trained for, what they had promised each other in whispered vows beneath starlight. They would hold even if it cost them everything. Yet now, because of some calculation on a sheet of paper, some cold assessment of survival and legacy, she was told to run. She felt heat rise in her chest, anger coiling with sorrow until her eyes burned and her breath came ragged. She thought of the stories her mother once told her, stories of ancestors who never abandoned their kin, who faced storms hand in hand, who chose courage over safety because they understood that survival without honor was only a shadow of living. Those stories rose in her blood now, stronger than the command she had been given, stronger than the fear that whispered of death. She would not leave them. She could not. To obey would be to betray everything she believed in, everything she had become. When the council dismissed her, she walked out with steady steps, but inside her decision was already forged. The valley wind cut across her face, carrying with it the scent of smoke, the faint metallic tang of blood, the dry dust stirred by footsteps of soldiers preparing for one last stand. She breathed it in, letting it sear her lungs, grounding herself in the reality of where she belonged. She found her companions gathered near the wall, their weapons stacked, their eyes grim but not broken. They looked at her with questions unspoken, questions they feared to ask because they already believed she would not remain. But she met their gaze, steady and unflinching, and in that silence they saw her answer before she gave it voice. She was not going anywhere. She would stand with them whatever the cost. And as the last light of the sun bled away beyond the mountains, she felt the quiet strength of that choice settle inside her like a flame refusing to die. Night settled heavy and thick over the valley, pressing down like a blanket woven of shadow and silence, and the compound seemed to hold its breath as if aware that the end was close. She stood on the wall with her rifle slung across her shoulder, the cold stone rough beneath her hands, her eyes scanning the darkness where the enemy lay unseen but never absent. Every creak of wood, every distant howl of the wind felt sharper now, as though the world itself wanted to remind them how fragile their hold on life had become. Around her the others moved with quiet precision, voices low, steps careful, each of them conserving strength for what they knew would come with the next dawn. They had not asked her why she had not boarded the transport, why she stood among them instead of following orders. They did not need to. Their looks, their brief touches on her arm as they passed, their nods that carried more weight than words ever could, told her all she needed to know. They were grateful not because she was any more skilled or strong than the rest, but because her choice meant something larger. It meant none of them would be abandoned. For the first time since the orders had been given, she felt peace. Not safety, not comfort, but the kind of peace that came from knowing you were exactly where you were supposed to be, even if it was the last place you would ever stand. She thought of the transport ship now gone, its engines roaring as it lifted into the sky, carrying with it the hope of memory and survival. Perhaps the council believed they had preserved something by sending it away, but she could not shake the feeling that the truest preservation was here, in the bond between those who remained. She could feel it in the way the captain murmured encouragement as he checked the defenses, in the farmer's steady movements as he distributed the last of the rations, in the boy-turned-man's quiet humming that drifted across the courtyard like a fragile prayer. Each act, small and almost invisible, was a defiance against the fear that threatened to hollow them out. She knew the enemy was waiting, massing in the darkness. Scouts had whispered of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, pushing through the forests and the ridges, their numbers like waves that would break upon the compound walls. They would not survive the morning, that much was clear. But they would make it cost. They would carve their defiance into the memory of the world, a message written in blood and fire that even if they were forgotten, they had not surrendered. The thought steadied her. She sat beside the wall, running her hands across the weapon she had carried for years, tracing every notch and scar upon its surface. It had been with her through battles where the sun burned the sky red, through nights when the stars seemed to watch in silence as comrades fell, through victories so small they had seemed meaningless until seen in the light of survival. She whispered to it now, not as an object, but as a companion, promising it that tomorrow it would not be abandoned, just as she had promised herself she would not abandon those around her. A shiver ran through the ground, faint at first, then stronger, and she knew the enemy was moving. The others felt it too, stiffening, exchanging glances, gripping weapons more tightly. She rose, her heart pounding not from fear but from anticipation. The first clash would come before dawn, perhaps sooner, and she was ready. As the hours dragged forward, she thought of what brought her here, the path that had shaped her. She remembered the day she had first arrived in this valley, a raw recruit with more determination than skill, stumbling under the weight of gear she barely knew how to use. She remembered the voices of those who had trained her, rough and uncompromising, but filled with a strange kind of care that only grew sharper in hardship. She remembered the first time she had been wounded, the sting of blood and fire in her side, and the hand that had dragged her back to safety despite the risk. All of it seemed to converge now, every memory building toward this moment, as if her whole life had been a long road leading to the wall where she now stood. She did not regret it. Not a single step. Around her the night deepened, and faint lights flickered on the horizon, the glow of torches or machines, the distant shimmer of movement that spoke of an army advancing. A hush fell over the compound, a collective silence that pressed on them all, and she felt her breath grow slow, steady, as if her body were aligning itself with the rhythm of the inevitable. When the boy beside her whispered that he was afraid, she placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and grounding, and told him fear was not weakness, only proof that they were still alive. He nodded, swallowing hard, and though his eyes still trembled, his grip on his weapon grew surer. The captain passed by, giving her a glance that carried both reproach and gratitude, as if he knew the risk she had taken by defying the council but also knew he could not have asked for anything braver. She met his gaze, unflinching, and for the first time she thought she saw pride there, the kind a commander rarely allowed himself to show. The wind shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of drums, low and resonant, echoing across the valley like the heartbeat of some monstrous beast. The enemy was close. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the sound wash through her, and when she opened them again she felt lighter, not because she expected survival, but because she had already chosen. No one could order her away now. No one could make her abandon what mattered. She was here with them and she would face the end not as a survivor sent into exile, but as one of many, bound together until the last breath. The first clash came just before dawn, a shuddering roar that split the silence of the night and hurled them all into the chaos they had been waiting for. The ground shook beneath the thunder of approaching feet, the compound walls groaning as shadows surged against them like a living tide. She was already in position, rifle raised, her breath slow, her heartbeat steady, the moment stretched thin as she took aim. The flare of fire cut the darkness, illuminating the faces of the enemy as they hurled themselves forward, and she pulled the trigger, each shot an answer to the drums that pounded in the distance. Around her the defenders roared, a chorus of defiance rising into the smoke-filled sky. Arrows whistled, bullets screamed, stones crashed from the walls, but still the enemy came endless, relentless, their numbers blotting out the horizon. She felt her shoulder jolt with each recoil, her ears ringing with the constant thunder of battle, but she did not falter. The boy beside her fired too, teeth clenched, fear sharpened into resolve, while the farmer hefted a spear like it was a plow turned against the storm. The captain shouted orders, his voice carrying above the chaos, pulling them into rhythm, into unity so that every strike, every defense, was more than just survival, it was a statement. Hours blurred together, the sky bleeding from black into gray, then into the pale red of dawn, but there was no end to the tide. The compound shook as ladders slammed against its walls, as grappling hooks tore into stone, as enemy warriors clambered upward like ants driven by hunger. She cut them down where she could, her hands aching, her body raw, but her spirit unyielding. Once, a figure vaulted over the wall, blade gleaming, and she met them head-on, steel against steel, the clash ringing in her bones. The fight was brutal, messy, too close for thought, but in the end she stood, chest heaving, her weapon slick with blood that was not her own. She looked to the others and saw the same grim fire in their eyes, the refusal to yield, the refusal to let the end come quietly. Yet even as they fought, even as they pushed back wave after wave, she knew the walls would not hold forever. Cracks split the stone, splinters flew from shattered wood, and the ground itself seemed to groan under the weight of the siege. But still they endured. She found herself thinking not of victory, but of moments, small, fragile moments stitched into the fabric of the chaos. The boy who smiled through blood on his lips after driving back an attacker. The farmer who laughed, wild and fearless, as he swung his spear with a strength born of desperation. The captain's steady hand on her shoulder when she nearly stumbled, a silent reminder that she was not alone. These moments burned brighter than fear, brighter than despair, and she clung to them like sparks in the darkness. The enemy withdrew at midday, a temporary lull as if even they needed breath, and the defenders sagged against the walls, gasping, wounded, bleeding, but alive. She lowered herself to the ground, her limbs trembling, her chest raw with exhaustion, yet her heart still steady. They had held if only for now. Around her the courtyard filled with the sounds of the aftermath, moans of the injured, hurried footsteps of those rushing water to the weary, quiet sobs from those who realized a friend had not risen from the wall. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the noise wash over her, but not to block it out. She wanted to feel it, every wound, every loss, because this was what it meant to stay. To turn away would have been to escape the pain but also the truth. She rose again, helping to carry the wounded to the center, binding wounds with strips of cloth torn from her own shirt, sharing what little water remained. No one spoke of retreat. No one even asked. They all knew the second wave would come, fiercer than the first, determined to shatter what had resisted them. And yet, as she looked around at the battered faces, at the stubborn eyes that still burned with fire, she felt a strange certainty. They would not give in, no matter how many waves broke upon them. The sun was high when she climbed the wall again, scanning the horizon where dust clouds stirred anew, marking the enemy's return. The boy joined her, his arm bandaged, his face pale but set with determination. "You should have left," he murmured, almost as if confessing a sin. She shook her head, her voice firm despite her weariness. "And leave you to face this alone? Never." He said nothing more, but his shoulders straightened, his grip tightened, and she saw the spark ignite again behind his tired eyes. Below them the captain raised his sword, rallying the defenders with words that carried like thunder. They would not fall quietly, they would not be erased, they would fight until the world itself remembered their names. She felt those words burn into her chest, anchoring her even as the horizon darkened once more with the enemy's approach. The drums began again, louder, faster, shaking the very air with their rhythm, and the tide of shadows surged forward. She tightened her grip, braced herself against the wall, and when the first scream split the air, she was already firing, already striking, already refusing to yield. For as long as she still drew breath, they would not face the end alone. The second wave struck with twice the fury of the first, a storm of fire and steel crashing against the weary defenders who had barely caught their breath. She braced herself as the wall trembled under the impact, the enemy surging like a flood determined to drown every last flicker of resistance. Arrows rained down in black clouds, their shrill whistle cutting the air before burying themselves into flesh and stone. She ducked low, dragging the boy beside her down as shafts clattered around them, then rose again to fire into the oncoming tide. Her weapon roared, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos, by the screams of men and women clashing, by the thunder of war drums that seemed to drive the enemy forward like a merciless god. The farmer fought like a giant, his spear sweeping arcs that knocked ladders from the walls, sending enemy soldiers tumbling into the pit below. The captain's voice rose above the din, sharp, commanding, forcing order out of the chaos, rallying their scattered lines into one force. She moved with them, every muscle burning, every breath ragged, yet her resolve never wavering. When the wall cracked, splinters of stone bursting outward as rams pounded against the gate, she leapt down into the courtyard, joining those who rushed to brace it. Her shoulders pressed against the wooden beams they had jammed behind the gate, every tremor of the impact rattling through her bones, but still she pushed, still she refused to let it fall. Around her others gritted their teeth, their bodies straining, sweat and blood mixing as the relentless pounding continued. It felt like an eternity, each heartbeat stretched until time itself seemed ready to snap, and then suddenly the pounding stopped. The enemy withdrew again, but this time only briefly, their retreat filled with the sound of horns that promised they would return with greater force. The defenders sagged, panting, battered, yet still alive. She slid down to sit against the wall, her body trembling, her hands raw from gripping the weapon, her lungs burning with smoke. The boy slumped beside her, his head resting against his knees, and for a moment there was silence between them, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of distant fires. She looked around the courtyard, at faces streaked with ash and blood, at eyes hollow yet still lit with defiance, and she felt a surge of fierce pride. They were breaking, all of them, yet none had given up. She found water and passed it around, watching as each sip was taken with care, shared rather than hoarded, proof that even here, even now, they clung to each other. In that small act of sharing she saw what the council had never understood. Legacy was not carried by one person fleeing into the sky, it was carried here, in the bonds between those who refused to abandon each other. The captain came to sit beside her, his armor dented, his sword chipped, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You should have left," he said quietly, echoing the boy's earlier words. But she shook her head, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Leaving would have been betrayal. My place is here with all of you." He studied her for a long moment, then gave the smallest of nods, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Then fight with me until the end." She gripped his hand briefly, a silent pact between them, then rose once more as the sound of the enemy swelled again beyond the walls. This time they came with fire. Flaming projectiles arced through the air, smashing into rooftops, igniting the thatched barracks and storage sheds. Smoke billowed upward, choking and thick, flames clawing toward the sky as defenders rushed to smother them with sand and water. She joined them, hauling buckets, beating at the flames with her cloak until her hands blistered, until her lungs were raw with the acrid air. Still the fire spread, relentless, devouring what little shelter remained. She felt despair gnaw at the edges of her resolve, whispering that the compound would burn before the enemy even breached the walls. But then she saw the farmer, his massive form silhouetted against the blaze, laughing as he poured water over the flames, shouting defiance into the smoke. His laughter was wild, reckless, yet it cut through the despair like a blade, reminding them all that fear had no place here. She found herself laughing too, breathless, half-mad but stronger for it. The others joined, and for a moment their laughter rose above the roar of the fire, a sound of humanity refusing to be silenced. When the flames were finally beaten back, leaving blackened ruins and smoldering ash, they returned to the wall once more. The enemy was waiting, gathering in greater numbers, their banners snapping in the wind, their weapons glinting under the dying light of the sun. She gripped her rifle, her body trembling with exhaustion but her spirit burning brighter than ever. The boy beside her wiped soot from his face, his eyes fierce, no trace of the trembling she had once seen. The captain raised his sword again, and the defenders answered with a roar that shook the very stones beneath their feet. The third wave would come with nightfall. And she knew with every fiber of her being, that no matter how many times they struck, no matter how close the end loomed, she would not falter. She had chosen to stay, and in that choice lay a strength greater than any command. Together they would hold, and together they would face whatever dawn might bring. Darkness returned with the third wave, and this time it was not only numbers that pressed against them but cruelty sharpened into precision. The enemy brought siege towers taller than the walls, great lumbering beasts of wood and iron pushed forward under cover of shields, their wheels grinding across the earth like the sound of inevitability. She watched them emerge from the smoke and shadows, their silhouettes monstrous against the faint light of the moon, and she knew this would be the hardest trial yet. The defenders braced themselves, but exhaustion had sunk deep into their bones, their arms heavy, their steps slower than before. She forced herself to stand tall, to ignore the ache that screamed in her muscles, to focus only on the weapon in her hands and the people at her side. When the towers crashed against the wall, the sound thundered through the compound, a terrible groaning roar as doors slammed open and enemies poured forth like a flood. Steel clashed in close combat, screams mingled with the clang of blades, and the night became a chaos of fire, blood, and shadows. She fought without thought of herself, every movement driven by instinct and the burning refusal to yield. A blade slashed across her arm, pain tearing white-hot through her flesh, but she ignored it, driving her attacker back with a desperate swing. The boy fought beside her, his face set in grim determination, his strikes clumsy but fierce, and she covered his flanks without hesitation, knowing his survival was tied to her own. The farmer roared somewhere nearby, his spear crashing through enemy lines, while the captain's voice cut through the din like a beacon, pulling them together again and again when they threatened to falter. Yet even as they fought, the walls began to collapse. Stones tumbled under the weight of the towers, splintering into rubble as enemy soldiers swarmed through gaps too wide to block. The defenders fell back step by step, forced into the heart of the compound where fire still smoldered from the earlier attack. The air was thick with smoke, heavy with the stench of blood, but they did not break. Every retreat was measured, every stand costing the enemy dearly, bodies littering the ground where their defiance left its mark. She felt her strength failing, her vision narrowing, but each time she staggered she saw another face beside her, another hand reaching to steady her, and she found the will to rise again. It was not survival that drove her anymore, it was the bond between them, the promise unspoken that none would face the end alone. The third wave dragged on until it felt endless, time shattered into nothing but screams and strikes, but at last the enemy fell back once more, retreating into the darkness with losses heavier than they had expected. The defenders collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to cheer, too weary even to speak. She sank to her knees, pressing her wounded arm, her breath ragged, sweat dripping down her face, and stared at the ruined compound around her. Half the buildings were gone, the walls broken, the ground littered with the dead. The boy slumped beside her, barely conscious, his eyes glazed, but when she touched his shoulder he managed a faint smile. That smile cut her deeper than any wound, because it reminded her of the innocence he had once carried, innocence lost long before this night, yet somehow still flickering in the ruins. She whispered words of encouragement, though she doubted he even heard them, then forced herself to stand again. The captain walked past, his steps heavy, his face grim, and she could see the truth in his eyes. They would not survive another wave. Yet he did not speak it, did not allow despair to poison what little strength remained. Instead he told them to rest, to take what moments they could before the dawn, because the enemy would not wait long to strike again. She found a corner of the courtyard where the smoke drifted thinly, and there she sat, staring up at the stars barely visible through the haze. For a moment she let herself imagine another life, one where the council's order had been obeyed, where she had left this place and flown far away into safety. But the thought filled her not with relief but with emptiness. To survive alone, to carry a story detached from the lives that had shaped it, would have been worse than death. Here, in the ashes of this compound, among the broken walls and wounded friends, she had found meaning deeper than survival. The boy stirred beside her, whispering that he wished he could see another sunrise. She held his hand and told him that they would see it together, whether in this world or the next, and in his tired eyes she saw trust, as if her words carried a weight greater than truth itself. The farmer joined them, his laughter quieter now but no less fierce, promising that he would plant fields again, even if only in memory. The captain stood watch, silent but unyielding, a sentinel against the coming storm. She leaned back against the wall, her body trembling, her wounds aching, and closed her eyes for a brief moment. Sleep hovered at the edges, but she forced it back, unwilling to let herself drift away while others still stood guard. She listened instead to the faint crackle of dying fires, to the ragged breaths of those who slept, to the distant horns of the enemy preparing once more. And as she listened, she felt her resolve harden again. The end might come with the next wave or the one after, but no matter when it came, she would meet it standing, unbroken, bound to the others by a choice that could not be undone. They had ordered her away but she had stayed. And now, as the night dragged toward dawn, she knew she would never regret it. Dawn broke not with light but with fire, the horizon glowing red as if the sun itself had been consumed by the fury of war. She rose stiffly from where she had rested, her body a map of pain and exhaustion, and gripped her weapon once more. Around her the others stirred, faces drawn and hollow yet eyes still burning. The captain gave no speech, no orders beyond the simple command to stand ready. They all knew what was coming. They could hear it in the earth itself, trembling with the march of countless feet, could feel it in the air, thick with the beat of war drums that seemed to shake the sky. She climbed the broken wall, her boots crunching on shattered stone, and gazed outward. What she saw made her breath catch, though she forced her expression to remain steady for the sake of those beside her. The valley was black with the enemy, stretching as far as the eye could see, their banners blotting out the dawn, their weapons gleaming like a sea of teeth. This was no wave. This was the storm itself, the final crushing force meant to erase them utterly. The boy climbed up beside her, pale and trembling but his jaw set. He whispered, "We cannot hold this," and she laid a hand on his shoulder answering, "Perhaps not, but we will not fall silently." He swallowed, then nodded, gripping his weapon tighter. Below them, the farmer muttered a prayer, half a joke and half a plea, promising to sow fields in whatever world awaited them. The captain drew his sword and raised it high, the battered steel catching the faint light, and the defenders roared with him, a sound torn from the depths of their souls, raw and defiant. The enemy surged forward, a tide of black armor and flashing steel, their horns screaming across the valley. Arrows filled the sky once more, and she fired into them, each shot deliberate, each strike cutting a thread from the endless mass. The wall shook under impact as siege towers rolled forward again, ladders slamming into place, rams battering at the shattered gates. The defenders fought like cornered lions, every strike fueled not by hope of victory but by the refusal to yield. She found herself at the center of the storm, blades crashing against her rifle, her fists striking when her weapon ran dry, her body moving with a ferocity she had never known. Beside her the boy fought with desperate courage, every wound he took slowing him but never stopping him, his face pale yet unbroken. She covered him again and again, dragging him back from the edge of death, refusing to let him fall. The farmer bellowed laughter through blood, swinging his spear like a tree tearing through grass, while the captain's voice rang above the chaos, pulling them into unity each time they threatened to scatter. Hours blurred into madness, the sky choked with smoke, the ground slick with blood. The compound shrank with every push, the defenders forced back from the walls into the courtyard, then from the courtyard toward the heart of the ruins. Every step cost them dearly, every retreat leaving more bodies behind, yet they held together, their bond forged unbreakable in fire. She stumbled at one point, a blade cutting deep into her leg, dropping her to one knee. For a heartbeat despair clawed at her, whispering that this was the end. But then the boy was there, standing over her, his weapon striking, his voice hoarse as he shouted her name. She forced herself up, pain screaming through her body, and together they pushed back, refusing to let the tide swallow them. She realized then that it no longer mattered how many enemies stood against them. What mattered was that none of them faced it alone. Even if the world erased them, even if their names were lost to history, in this moment they were bound, unyielding, together until the last breath. The gates finally collapsed with a shattering roar, enemy soldiers pouring through like a river breaking a dam. The defenders made their last stand in the ruins, backs to the burning barracks, weapons raised though their arms trembled. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the captain, the boy on her other side, the farmer roaring behind them, and they fought as one, their cries rising above the endless storm. She lost track of time, of wounds, of blood. The world narrowed to the strike of steel, the thud of arrows, the press of bodies against hers. Her vision blurred, her breath ragged, yet she did not fall. She could not. Somewhere in the chaos she heard the boy laugh, wild and fearless, and she laughed with him, though her throat burned with smoke. It was not madness, it was freedom, the release of knowing they had already defied what the council had intended. They had stayed. They had fought. They had chosen each other. The enemy pressed harder, and she knew the end was close. But even as she staggered under another blow, even as her strength failed, she felt no regret. She had given everything, not in obedience to orders, but in loyalty to those who mattered. As the sun reached its peak above the smoke-filled sky, she raised her weapon one last time, a cry tearing from her throat that carried across the battlefield. It was not a cry of despair but of defiance, the sound of a heart that refused to be silenced. And as the enemy surged around her, she stood unbroken, bound to the others in the fire of their final stand. The courtyard was a furnace of fire and screams, every breath torn from smoke, every heartbeat hammered against the drum of chaos. She had lost count of how many waves had come, how many times they had been pushed back, how many comrades had fallen, but still she fought, her body a ruin of wounds and exhaustion. The boy at her side staggered, blood running from a cut across his forehead, but his grip never loosened, his strike still fierce despite his trembling. She steadied him when he faltered, her own strength pouring into him as if by sheer will she could keep him upright. The farmer bellowed somewhere nearby, his laughter now hoarse, each swing of his weapon slower but still devastating, while the captain stood unyielding at the center, his sword flashing even as blood soaked his armor. The enemy swarmed like locusts, endless, pouring through every breach, clambering over rubble, their shouts rising in triumph each time a defender fell. The compound was gone in all but name, walls shattered, buildings collapsed, flames devouring what little still stood. And yet within that ruin the defenders burned brighter than ever, their resistance carved into every blow, every cry, every drop of blood spilled. She felt the end pressing close, felt it in her bones, yet there was no fear left in her, only a strange clarity. She realized she had become something more than herself, that each strike she made was not hers alone but part of a whole, the combined defiance of every soul who still stood here. Her body screamed with pain, her wounds tore wider with each movement, but her spirit was weightless, as if lifted by the bond between them. When the boy fell to one knee, she caught him under the arm and dragged him upright, her voice fierce as she told him he was not allowed to fall yet. He looked at her through blood and smoke, and despite everything he smiled. That smile gave her strength enough to face another charge, enough to fight through the agony blazing in her leg and shoulder. The farmer went down next, a spear driven through his chest, yet even as he collapsed he seized the enemy soldier and dragged him down, laughing through blood until his last breath. His fall struck them like a hammer, grief burning sharper than any wound, but it did not break them. If anything, it drove them harder, their fury redoubled as they fought over his body, refusing to let it be dishonored. She felt the farmer's laughter still ringing in her ears, carrying her forward. The captain roared then, a sound that silenced even the enemy for a heartbeat, his sword rising high before crashing down in a blaze of fury. He fought like a storm-given flesh, unstoppable despite the blood pouring from his side, his will alone holding the defenders together. She pressed to his flank, covering him, every step an act of defiance against the tide. The boy was there too, pale and swaying, but striking with desperate precision, his youth burned away in the crucible of this final stand. Together they formed a circle of resistance, back to back, cutting down any who came too near. But numbers could not be denied forever. For every enemy they felled, two more took their place. The circle shrank, the bodies piled higher, the smoke thickened until the sky vanished. She could barely see, barely breathe, yet she would not stop. Her arms felt like lead, her weapon slick with blood, her legs trembling under her, but she fought on. She thought of the council's command, of the order to leave, and felt a bitter laugh rise in her chest. If she had obeyed, she would not have known this, would not have stood shoulder to shoulder with those who mattered most, would not have felt the fierce beauty of defiance even at the edge of death. She would have lived, yes, but hollow, carrying only regret. Now she carried pride, pride sharper than pain, pride that bound her to these people forever. A sudden crash split the air, the last of the gates collapsing entirely, the enemy pouring in a flood that swept away what remained of the courtyard. The captain raised his sword one last time, his roar defiant, and they answered with him, their voices rising together, drowning out the drums, drowning out the enemy's cries. She felt the sound tear from her throat, raw and powerful, and for a moment it seemed as though the very ground trembled with their defiance. The clash was final, brutal, the tide breaking over them in unstoppable force. She lost sight of the boy, lost sight of the captain, her world narrowing to flashes of steel and bursts of pain. She struck again and again, even when her body no longer obeyed, even when her vision blurred with smoke and blood. An enemy blade cut deep across her side, driving her to her knees, but still she fought, dragging herself upright with a snarl of refusal. Another blow struck her down again, and this time she could not rise. She lay on the broken ground, the roar of battle crashing around her, her weapon fallen from her grasp. Yet even there, even on the edge of death, she felt no fear. She turned her head and saw the boy still fighting, though barely standing, his body swaying, his strikes wild but unyielding. She saw the captain, bloodied and broken, still raising his sword with the strength of pure will. She saw the defenders giving their last breaths in unison, none turning away, none surrendering. A slow smile curved her lips, even as darkness edged her vision. They had ordered her away, but she had stayed. And now, in the heart of fire and ruin, she knew she had made the only choice worth making. The ground was soaked with ash and blood, the air thick with smoke that turned the sun into nothing but a pale ember behind the haze. She drifted in and out of awareness, her body broken, her breath shallow, but her spirit clung stubbornly to the world. The roar of battle had faded into a heavy silence broken only by the crackle of flames and the occasional groan of stone collapsing. The enemy had swept over them like a flood, and yet even now, even in defeat, she felt no shame. She had stood, she had fought, and she had kept her promise not to leave them. Her eyes fluttered open, and through the haze she saw the boy lying near her, motionless at first, and terror seized her. But then, with painful slowness, he stirred, his chest rising, his eyes half opening. Relief struck her so sharply she almost wept, though she had no tears left. He was alive, barely but alive, and that was enough. She reached for him, her hand trembling, and their fingers touched, a fragile bridge of warmth in the ruin. He managed the faintest of smiles, lips cracked and bloody, but it was a smile nonetheless. She wanted to tell him he had done well, that he had been braver than any could ask, but her voice was gone, her throat raw and silent. She hoped he understood anyway, hoped her gaze carried the words her lips could not form. Beyond him, the captain was still standing, or perhaps only the ghost of a man propped up by his own will. His armor was in pieces, his body broken, yet his sword remained in his grasp, its tip driven into the ground to keep him upright. He did not move now, and she knew he would never move again, but the sight of him standing, unbowed even in death, filled her with a pride so fierce it banished despair. Around him lay the fallen, the farmer among them, his face strangely peaceful despite the spear still jutting from his chest. They had given everything, and in that giving, they had created something that even fire and blood could not erase. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened, and it seemed to her that beneath the silence, beneath the smoke, there was still the echo of their defiance ringing in the air, a sound that no enemy could silence. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate, and her eyes snapped open. Through the shifting smoke she saw figures moving, enemy soldiers, their armor dented and scorched, their weapons still dripping red. They moved cautiously as if wary of ghosts, glancing at the bodies strewn around as though expecting the fallen to rise again. One of them stopped near her, staring down at her broken form. She met his gaze, unflinching, and for a long moment neither moved. Then, to her astonishment, he lowered his weapon. His companions shifted uneasily, murmuring, but he did not strike. Perhaps he saw the fire still burning in her eyes, perhaps he saw that to kill her now would gain nothing, for she was already beyond their power. Or perhaps, in that brief moment, he felt the weight of what they had faced here, the unyielding spirit that had refused to bow. Whatever the reason, he turned and moved on, leaving her where she lay. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her chest shuddering with the effort. The boy's hand tightened weakly around hers and she squeezed back, her strength fading but her resolve unbroken. She whispered in her mind, if not aloud, that they had not failed, no matter what the world might say. They had stood until the end, and that was victory enough. Time became strange, stretching and collapsing, moments blurring together. She drifted on the edge of darkness, sometimes sinking, sometimes clawing back to the surface. At one point she thought she heard voices, not enemy shouts but gentler tones, hushed and urgent. She felt hands lifting her, carrying her, the boy's presence still near. She did not know who they were, perhaps survivors who had hidden, perhaps allies arriving too late, but she surrendered to them, too weak to resist. She only prayed the boy was carried too. Days might have passed, or only hours. She woke again beneath a different sky, clean and blue, though she could not tell if it was real or dream. Her wounds burned, her body refused to move, but she breathed still, and with each breath came the memory of those who had not. She would live, though she did not yet understand why she had been spared when so many had fallen. But she knew one thing with unshakable certainty: she would carry their names, their laughter, their courage, with her until her last day. She had refused to leave them, and now she would refuse to let them be forgotten. Her eyes closed once more, and this time there was no fear of the darkness waiting. For she knew that even in silence, even in absence, they were with her still, standing unbowed in the fire, their voices forever echoing in her heart. The end.